One should always be ready to learn new things, and there are two important lessons I've taken from the last 2 weeks. Firstly, it was probably a mistake to increase the scope of the game so steeply in month 2, and secondly, perhaps I should have reserved Battle Royale Tycoon for some other month, like, say, one that I wasn't going to partially spend at the fucking Electronic fucking Entertainment fucking Expo. Things have been tight. Pre-Flight Panic was basically playable within days. This one isn't close to being a game yet. Still, maybe I needed a trial by fire early on in the year before I started really burning myself out. The hardest part is the basics of the Battle Royale simulation. That's the maypole around which everything else will prance, and thankfully most of that's in place. Now it's just a matter of how much we can get prancing around it by the end of the month. Don't worry, you'll have something to play at the end of all this. By the way, thanks to everyone who pointed out that Battle Royale Tycoon is already the name of something on Steam. Albeit something different to what I have in mind. No worries, it was always a working title, and meaning no offence to the other Battle Royale Tycoon, kind of a shitty one. So from now on we'll call the project BRTV. Here's what there is to see of BRTV right now. We have the map, the players, you can place the safe zone, the players move around, loot buildings and kill each other. One of my weaknesses as a game dev is that I have a tendency to procrastinate when faced with a tricky coding challenge, and tend to obsess on little details, if it means I can put off the harder parts. For example, first thing I did was have the game draw a big green square for the map, but that looked too plain, so I then spent an entire day obsessively working on a random terrain generator before I even started adding characters. Still, I'm pretty happy with how it turned out, as well as the random face and name generators I also used to procrastinate with. I always enjoy making random name generators, building lists of my favourite inherently funny words. I've even modded them into games in the past, haven't I, Kenneth Gurgleton? Deborah Munchzone? Haven't I, Linda Dimplecunk? See, this is an advantage and disadvantage of solo development. No one's checking up on me to keep me focused, but no one's stopping me from having fun, either. So here's the short list of what we need to add to make this a game. We still need that whole business with the drone camera. Then we need a system for it to record kills and interesting events and hand out points accordingly. Lastly, a set of levels, so that if the player scores enough points, they can move to the next one. So it's mainly secondary and tertiary gameplay loop stuff at this point. And speaking of loops, a few of you have asked me to talk through some of my code that I've occasionally been teasing you with. I've been hesitant, partly because I want this series to be more about art and philosophy than tech tutorials, partly because I'm slightly self-conscious of my amateurish coding and the bad habits that riddle it, but what the hell, this is a pretty AI-focused project. Let me walk you through the AI for the Battle Royale participants. So, this is code that every player executes every frame. For the sake of clarity, let's refer to this specific player as Brian. Ignore the first part, because that's mostly handling drawing and animation. Let's start at the point where Brian is landed on the ground and ready to go. First thing we do is make sure he isn't in the middle of a death or attack animation set off by a previous frame, because Brian's obviously not going to be making any new decisions while that's happening. Maybe he's thinking about what's for dinner after this, but we'll leave that for the player to infer. So, assuming the AI is switched on and Brian is free to act, there are currently only 2 things in the world he understands: buildings to loot and other players to kill. So we check in with all of them and see if any are within Brian's reach. Brian is not interested in dead players or looted buildings, so if he's finished with the nearby stuff, the next thing he'll do is think about moving. So the next thing Brian does is call up the main map object, which he refers to as his parent because it was what spawned him, to request 2 pieces of information: how big the current safe zone is and where the centre of it is. From this, Brian deduces how far and in what direction he needs to move to be safe. If he's not already in the safe zone, we could just have him make a beeline for the safe zone centre, but what if he spots a nearby building or other player? Does he have time to interact with it and still get to safety? That's what the AI spread variable is for. This defines the width of a sort of visibility cone extending from Brian towards the safe zone centre. Essentially, this defines all the directions Brian is prepared to move in. It's narrow when he's far from the safe circle and gets wider the closer he gets to it, because the closer he is to safety, the more willing he is to take little detours. After establishing the spread, we pick a random direction from it and a random direction to move, so this will be what he'll do if nothing else comes up. So the next thing to do is look for anything worth investigating. We start by looking for the nearest building that's unlooted, in Brian's visible range and inside his fan of safety. Then we assign that building's instance to a variable within Brian, loot build. Then, again assuming we're not recovering from a previous attack, Brian does the same thing to other players, assign the nearest one to a variable called NME. If both variables remain empty after this check, Brian will just default to his random movement. Otherwise, he'll head towards the nearest building or player. If he doesn't have a weapon yet, he'll head for the building first. If he does, or he can't see a building, he'll prioritise enemy players first. So that about gives you the full picture of how Brian's thinking works. There are a lot of ways it could be made more complex, but I think one simple addition would be to give Brian the potential to be spooked by something. So if an enemy player attacked him or he heard a gunshot or whatever, he could temporarily define his idea of a safe direction to move in based on his relative position to whatever spooked him, rather than the centre of the safe zone. Right, that's the end of the coding segment. Sorry if it was a bit dry. If you're still awake, let's field a question.
Hey, I've followed several game design courses at uni and attempted to create a couple of games, but have a nasty habit of making my projects too big. How do you personally limit your scope to prevent this from happening?
I'm glad you asked me this, Superstino. I've touched upon it briefly before, but I want to go into detail. I have this mad idea that some people might take advice from me, and if there's only one piece of advice I'd like taken away from this entire series, it's this. Focus on the primary gameplay loop. The primary gameplay loop, as I understand it, refers to what you want the player to be trying to achieve on a second-by-second basis. So in something like Doom, this would be move around, shoot monsters. Or in Pac-Man, it's eat pills, avoid ghosts. Most games will also have a secondary loop, which is what you're trying to achieve from minute to minute, and a tertiary loop for hour to hour, roughly speaking. So the secondary loop of Pac-Man would be eating every pill in the level. The tertiary loop would be beating enough levels to get a high score. And that's as deep as Pac-Man gets. But other games have even more loops. You can have as many layers as you like, but ultimately they all come down to the constant repetition of a primary loop. It needn't necessarily be seconds long either. If you're making something more cerebral, business sim, turn-based strategy, something menu-driven, you can expect a higher attention span from the target audience and your primary loop can spread out a bit. But even then, it's perfectly possible to make the mere act of navigating a menu and pressing buttons fun and engaging. Look at Persona 5 for a crash course in that. But I digress. Your task as a game designer is to make sure that the primary loop is fun and or engaging. In my current project, BRTV, the primary loop basically boils down to watching other people have fun, so I'm going to try to add enough animation and sound and humour to make that fun in itself. Now, I know what you're thinking. Duh, Yahtzee. Of course I understand the game needs to be fun. What do you think I am, a MOBA developer? Well, the thing is, in my time I've heard a lot of game ideas and pitches from amateurs and indies and people interested in breaking in, and I'm frequently astonished by how often the primary loop just isn't considered. Recently I was enlisted by a friend who runs a game design course at a local high school to take a look at some game pitch ideas that some students had made, and there were some interesting concepts. Let's make a horror game about a dude being chased by demons representing his sins. Let's do an RPG with management elements where you add towns and villages to your kingdom as you go. None of them knew what to say when I asked what the primary loop was. We start the game, we're given control, what happens next? I don't know, just standard movement and combat. What does that mean? Where's the camera? How fast can we move? What kind of combat? Real-time, turn-based, ranged, melee? Do enemies come in waves? Or stand around waiting in groups like penguins in a cold snap? Look, we've all got big ideas. We all want to recreate the crazy expansive AAA games that influence us, but if you're not thinking about your primary loop, a big idea is all you will have. Because like I said last time, don't build a house from the roof downwards. Actually, it's more like trying to build a house before you've invented the brick. Yeah, think of it like that if it helps. The primary loop is a brick, the secondary loop is a wall, and the tertiary loop is a room. To bring up Mario 64 again, the developers of that did not start by saying it's a game about Mario rescuing a princess and, I don't know, jumping's involved, start making levels. They started with Mario by himself, and they iterated and iterated until just moving him around was fun to do. So that's my advice. Start with an empty room, put a dude in it, then keep fiddling with his movement physics and his animation and the little dust clouds that come up when he turns around too quick until you're thinking, boy, I could just move this dude around this empty room all day. Then put one single enemy in the room, 20 go to 10. Do all that, then think about scope. And if you're still taking advice, ideally do all of this before you run to a crowdfunding website with 2 bits of concept art and a bad attitude.